She was 63 and pregnant. No one thought it was possible, least of all her doctors. But why would a woman risk everything to carry a child she shouldn't have been able to? Every choice she made, every promise she kept, was being watched, manipulated, controlled. And now the truth she never wanted to face is closing in. What if the miracle she celebrated was never hers to begin with? The secret behind her pregnancy is darker than anyone could imagine. Margaret Hale had learned not to expect gifts from life anymore. At 63, the world had grown quiet around her, the kind of silence that settles after decades of compromise, loss, and careful endurance. Her husband was gone, her friends scattered into their own small storms, and the house she lived in seemed to breathe only when she moved through it. So when the nausea began, she dismissed it as age. When the dizziness followed, she blamed the heat. It was only after the third morning, kneeling on the cold bathroom floor, that a strange thought surfaced, one she laughed at before it fully formed. The test trembled in her hand. Margaret stared, blinking, waiting for reason to correct the mistake. Instead, the result remained unchanging, undeniable. She sat down slowly, her back against the cabinet, and for the first time in years she cried without knowing why. The tears were not fear, they were relief. In her mind, the pregnancy became a miracle, a final chapter rewritten by something larger than regret. She imagined tiny socks, imagined laughter returning to the walls, imagined purpose blooming where grief had settled. The risks did not interest her. The warnings had not yet arrived. At the clinic, fluorescent lights hummed above her as she waited. The nurse smiled politely, but the smile faltered when she checked Margaret's date of birth. The room felt colder after that. When the doctor entered, he did not congratulate her. He studied the file longer than necessary, then studied her face as if searching for something hidden beneath the skin. "This is unusual," he said carefully. Margaret tilted her head, defensive but calm. "Unusual doesn't mean impossible," the doctor swallowed. He spoke of tests, of confirmations, of dangers that came with age. His voice was clinical, practiced, but something beneath it betrayed unease. Margaret noticed the way his hand tightened around the pen, the way he avoided the word miracle. She left with pamphlets she did not read and appointments she had not agreed to. Outside, the air felt too sharp, too real. Her phone vibrated before she reached her car. "Did you find out?" a man's voice asked softly. "Yes," Margaret said, pressing the phone to her ear. Her smile returned, small but certain. "It's real." There was a pause, then quieter, the voice replied, "Good. Then everything is moving exactly as it should." Margaret looked back at the clinic doors, unease brushing past her joy like a shadow she refused to name. Later that night, the doctor called her at home. His tone was no longer measured, no longer distant. He asked questions she did not understand and paused too long between them. Finally, he said there were results already, anomalies that concerned the entire department. Margaret listened, fingers resting protectively on her stomach, heart steady in defiance. When he finished, he lowered his voice, almost pleading. "Mrs. Hale," he whispered, "this pregnancy should not be possible." The line went dead before she could respond. Margaret sat in the dark kitchen, phone pressed to her chest, joy trembling into something sharper. Outside, the house creaked softly as if listening. For the first time since the test, fear finally found its way in. She did not yet know what the miracle would demand from her next alone. Morning came without comfort. Margaret Hale woke with the echo of the doctor's whisper still lodged in her chest, a thin wire of dread pulling tighter with every breath. She moved through the house slowly, touching the counters, the window frames, grounding herself in the ordinary. The miracle, she told herself, had not vanished overnight. At the hospital, the conference room smelled of disinfectant and restraint. 2 doctors, then 3, then a woman from ethics, all speaking gently, carefully, as if volume alone might shatter her. Charts appeared, numbers followed. Risks stacked neatly on the table between them. Stroke, hemorrhage, failure. The words were heavy, deliberate. They spoke of termination. Margaret listened with her hands folded over her stomach, spine straight, eyes calm. When they finished, silence stretched, waiting for her consent. She felt something settle inside her, not panic, not doubt, but resolve. "No," she said. The room shifted. One doctor leaned forward, voice urgent now, explaining timelines and probabilities. Another offered sympathy disguised as authority. Margaret shook her head once. She did not argue, she did not explain. The decision felt older than the room, older than the fear pressing in from every side. "I'm keeping the baby," she said softly. They exchanged looks. Someone asked if she understood the consequences. Margaret smiled, faint but unwavering. Understanding, she had learned, did not always protect you. Sometimes it only clarified the cost. She signed nothing, accepted nothing. When she stood to leave, her knees trembled, but her voice did not. In the hallway, a nurse touched her arm, whispering, "Please reconsider." Margaret pulled away gently, almost kindly, and kept walking. Outside, the sun was too bright. Her phone rang before she reached the parking lot. She did not check the caller ID. "It's done," she said when the line connected. "You refused?" the man asked. "Yes," a breath of relief crossed the line, followed by something darker. "Good, you did exactly right." Margaret hesitated. "They said it's dangerous." "They always do," he replied smoothly. "Fear is how they control people like you." The word like lingered. Margaret frowned but said nothing. That afternoon, more calls came, hospital administrators, counselors. Even her insurance provider. Each conversation pressed the same direction, dressed in different language. Margaret repeated her answer until it felt mechanical. By evening, exhaustion settled into her bones. She stood at the kitchen sink as the phone rang again. This time it was the doctor. His voice was strained, stripped of professionalism. He warned her about legal reviews, emergency protocols, things that could no longer be undone. When he finished, he waited. "I've made my choice," Margaret said. After she hung up, the silence felt staged, expectant. Her phone vibrated once more. A message appeared, short and precise. "I knew you would keep your promise." Margaret stared at the screen. Promise. The word tightened her throat. She had made it months ago, whispered during a night she barely remembered clearly. Back then, it had felt like hope. Now it felt like a contract she did not know how to escape. She typed nothing, set the phone face down. In the reflection of the dark window, her face looked unfamiliar, older and younger all at once. She pressed a hand to her stomach, breath shallow, heart racing. Somewhere beyond the glass, a car engine started and idled, waiting longer than necessary. Margaret did not look outside. She already sensed she was no longer alone. She felt eyes on the house, patient and familiar, belonging to someone who had been waiting for this exact refusal tonight alone. Margaret did not sleep. The car outside eventually left, but the feeling of being watched lingered into dawn, curling through her thoughts like smoke. By morning, the house no longer felt like shelter. It felt like evidence. When the knock finally came, she was already standing in the hallway, waiting. Evan Cross smiled as if he belonged there. He was younger than her, early 40s maybe, dressed neatly, carrying coffee in one hand and familiarity in the other. He kissed her cheek without asking and stepped inside before she could object. The house seemed to accept him more easily than she did. "I couldn't stop thinking about you," he said gently. "After yesterday," Margaret nodded, suddenly unsure how to explain the heaviness in her chest. Evan moved through the kitchen with ease, placing the coffee down, adjusting a chair, filling the silence with calm certainty. His presence smoothed the sharp edges of her fear, even as it deepened them. At the hospital later that day, Evan stayed close, too close. He held Margaret's hand during intake, answered questions meant for her, corrected dates she struggled to remember. When a nurse asked about next of kin, Evan spoke before Margaret could open her mouth. "I'm her partner," he said. The word landed softly but carried weight. Margaret did not correct him. Doctors reappeared, their tone cautious but firmer now. They addressed Evan directly, explaining procedures, outlining contingency plans. Margaret felt herself shrinking, becoming secondary to conversations about her own body. Evan squeezed her hand reassuringly, his thumb pressing lightly, a reminder of where decisions belonged. "She doesn't need to be frightened," Evan said. "She's made her choice." Margaret looked at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. She wondered when her decision had become shared property. During an ultrasound, the technician frowned, adjusting angles, taking longer than necessary. Evan leaned forward, watching the screen with intense focus. Margaret searched his face for joy, for wonder, but found only concentration, as if he were checking progress on something unfinished. Afterward, while Margaret changed, a nurse lingered. "He's very involved," she said carefully. Margaret smiled weakly. "He cares." The nurse nodded, unconvinced. Paperwork followed, consent forms, monitoring agreements, emergency authorizations. Margaret's vision blurred as fatigue set in. Evan guided the pen into her hand, whispering reassurance. When she paused, uncertain, he gently took the clipboard. "I'll handle it," he said. Margaret did not see every page he signed. As they left, a doctor pulled Margaret aside, lowering his voice. "If at any point you feel pressured—" "I don't," Margaret said quickly. The lie surprised even her. That evening, Evan insisted on staying. He checked the locks, closed the curtains, adjusted the thermostat. He spoke about the future in precise terms, timelines and preparations that felt premature. Margaret listened, comforted and unsettled all at once. "You trust me, don't you?" he asked suddenly. She hesitated, then nodded. Trust felt easier than doubt. Later, alone in the hospital corridor, the nurse from earlier reviewed the intake file once more. Her eyes paused on a signature line. The handwriting was firm, confident, unmistakably male. She checked the timestamp, then the name. It wasn't Margaret Hale, S. The nurse looked up toward the exit, where Evan Cross was helping Margaret into the car, his hand firm at her back. A quiet unease settled in her stomach as she reached for the phone. Something about the man who shouldn't exist felt dangerously real. Margaret felt the shift but could not name it. As the car pulled away, she watched the hospital shrink behind them, wondering when she had last chosen direction herself. Evan's voice filled the space, steady and guiding, and she let it. Control, she told herself, could feel like care. Yet somewhere beneath the reassurance, a warning stirred, faint and persistent, reminding her that miracles sometimes arrive wearing borrowed faces and borrowed names she barely recognized. Margaret dreamed of doors that would not open. She woke with the echo of Evan's voice still guiding her thoughts, his certainty lingering like a second heartbeat. The house felt different with him inside it, quieter but heavier, as if the walls remembered something she had tried hard to forget. She moved through the morning carefully, avoiding mirrors. The past did not arrive all at once. It whispered. It slipped in through the cracks Evan unknowingly resembled, the way he corrected her gently, the way his patience carried an edge. These were not new sensations. They were familiar ones. Years earlier, before widowhood softened the memories, Margaret had been someone else's responsibility. Thomas Hale had never raised his voice. He never needed to. Control came in structure, in routine, in the quiet suggestion that Margaret was safest when decisions were removed from her hands. He chose their friends. He chose where they lived. When she hesitated, he reminded her how easily things could fall apart. She learned to call it love. Margaret sat at the kitchen table now, hands wrapped around cold tea, drifting between then and now. Evan's footsteps echoed upstairs, measured, purposeful. The sound tightened her chest. Thomas used to walk that way too, as if direction itself bent toward him. A memory surfaced without permission. Margaret standing in a doctor's office decades ago, younger, frightened, being told she could not carry a child. Thomas had smiled afterward, told her it was a relief. Children complicated things, he said. She remembered nodding, grateful he had decided for her. The kettle whistled. She startled, breath sharp. Evan appeared in the doorway, watching her too closely. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes," she said quickly. He nodded, satisfied, and returned upstairs. Later, alone, Margaret opened an old box tucked deep in the closet. Inside were photographs she rarely touched, smiles that looked practiced, vacations she barely remembered enjoying. She found a hospital bracelet with her maiden name, yellowed with age. She could not recall why she kept it, only that she had never thrown it away. The house creaked as Evan moved above her. Margaret closed the box, heart racing. She realized then that this pregnancy had reopened doors she thought were sealed forever. Being needed, being chosen, being directed. That night, as rain tapped against the windows, Margaret lay awake beside Evan, listening to his breathing. Her thoughts drifted backward, connecting patterns she had avoided naming. Evan's affection came with conditions. His reassurance required obedience. She wondered when comfort had begun to feel like containment. A quiet thought formed, dangerous and unwelcome. What if her joy was not entirely her own? What if it had been shaped, encouraged, guided toward this exact outcome? Evan shifted beside her, murmuring her name in his sleep. Margaret turned toward the wall, tears slipping silently into the pillow. The past was no longer whispering. It was clearing its throat, preparing to speak. By morning, she knew something had changed. The miracle still lived inside her, but doubt had joined it, small and sharp. As Evan spoke about appointments and plans, Margaret nodded automatically. Yet beneath her compliance, a memory pulsed, steady and insistent, reminding her that love had once worn this same calm expression. She did not yet know how to confront it. She only knew the past had returned, and it would not remain quiet for long. It waited patiently, like someone rehearsing a story they had told before. Confident Margaret would listen again, whether she was ready or not, whether she wanted truth. Or only the illusion of safety once more now. The phone rang late that afternoon, cutting through the hum of the rain-soaked house. Margaret picked it up hesitantly, expecting another clinic call, another question about risks or paperwork. Instead, a voice she had not heard in decades whispered her name. "Mom!" Margaret froze. The tone carried caution, suspicion, and longing all at once. Clare Bennett, her estranged daughter, had returned to her life after years of absence. The silence between them had been long, heavy, full of things neither wanted to name. Margaret hadn't realized how much she had missed the sound of Clare's voice until now. "What are you doing here?" Margaret asked carefully, trying to mask the tremor in her tone. "I need to see you," Clare said, her words clipped, measured. "It's important." The memory of Clare's departure flashed sharply, packed bags, slammed doors, and Margaret standing frozen, unable to stop her. There had been no goodbyes, no explanations. Only distance that stretched into years. Now Clare was back, standing on the threshold of a life Margaret thought she had left behind. When Clare arrived, she carried herself with the same cautious elegance she had as a child, but years had honed the sharpness in her eyes. They walked through the house together, speaking little. Margaret tried to fill the silence with explanations about her pregnancy, but every sentence felt hollow against the weight of years lost. Clare listened, nodding, but the questions in her gaze remained unsaid. They sat in the living room where old family photos lined the walls, and Margaret felt suddenly exposed. Clare's silence was louder than words, probing, searching. Finally, Clare spoke, her voice low and deliberate. "I know something's not right," she said. "I don't know what, but I can feel it." Margaret shook her head, a protective instinct rising. "It's fine." "Everything's fine." Clare studied her mother's face, noticing the subtle tremor in her hands, the way she flinched at every car passing the window. "You're scared," Clare said softly. "And you're hiding it again." Margaret's chest tightened. Fear, embarrassment, and guilt collided. She had promised herself she would protect Clare from the past, from Evan, from the dangerous hope of miracles. But seeing her daughter, hearing her voice, Margaret realized that the past had already crept back, uninvited. "I'm okay," she whispered, though her voice carried a weight of doubt. Clare remained silent for a moment, then stood, pacing slowly. "I need to know everything," she said, more to herself than Margaret. "The pregnancy, the man, the choices. Did someone force your hand?" Margaret looked at her daughter, heart hammering. How much could she tell without unraveling everything? She wanted to shield Clare, to keep her safe from what she feared was coming. Yet the tension between them had reached a breaking point, the unspoken truths pressing like hands around her throat. Before Margaret could respond, Clare's gaze fell on a stack of papers on the side table, fertility clinic documents she had never seen before. She picked them up slowly, eyes scanning quickly. Margaret's stomach knotted as she realized her careful control might already be slipping. "These are from years ago," Clare murmured, her voice shaking slightly. "Why are these here?" "And why didn't you ever tell me?" Margaret swallowed, trying to maintain composure. "They're nothing, just old records." But Clare's eyes narrowed. She had always inherited her mother's instinct for detecting the hidden, the unspoken. "Mom, this isn't nothing," she said firmly. "Someone's been shaping your choices. And I need to know who." The room fell silent. Outside, rain streaked the windows, drumming a nervous rhythm. Margaret realized, with a sharp pulse of dread, that the presence of her daughter had pulled the shadows closer. She could no longer pretend she was alone in this. Clare's hand tightened around the papers, and for the first time since she arrived, Margaret saw resolve, not just concern. It was a quiet, dangerous force, one that would push forward whether Margaret was ready or not. And in that moment, Margaret understood that the carefully constructed world she had built, the joy, the secrecy, the fragile control over her pregnancy, was no longer entirely hers to guard. Something old and powerful had returned, not just in the house, but through the daughter who had once stayed silent and now refused to do so. Clare could not stop thinking about the papers she had found. Fertility clinic records, old appointments, consent forms, Margaret had never mentioned any of them. Something about the dates and signatures did not make sense. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical, and some of the entries were signed years before Margaret had ever met Evan. That evening, Clare returned home with the documents in hand. She spread them across the kitchen table, scanning names, dates, and procedures. The more she read, the colder the air felt around her. Margaret watched from the doorway, anxiety knotting her stomach. She knew some of the secrets were too dangerous to voice, yet the weight of being discovered now pressed on her chest like lead. "Mom, this isn't just a normal pregnancy, is it?" Claire asked softly, her eyes tracing the strange annotations in the files. Margaret shook her head, swallowing hard. I don't know how to explain." Claire stepped closer, her hand hovering over the papers. "Someone has been involved for years. Look at this, fertility treatments that predate everything you've told me. Who is Evan really?" Margaret avoided her daughter's gaze. She remembered the late nights when phone calls came from unknown numbers, when deliveries appeared with instructions she never requested. And now Evan's arrival, calm and certain, fit into a larger design she had only glimpsed. A design built not on love or chance, but on careful, deliberate manipulation. "I trusted him," Margaret whispered, voice trembling. "I thought he cared, I thought he was protecting me." Claire's eyes narrowed, determination hardening them. "He's controlling you. He's using you, this pregnancy, it's part of it. I can feel it. Someone engineered this and he's the final piece." Margaret's hands shook. She had wanted to believe in miracles, in the joy of carrying life at 63, but doubt had settled deep within her bones. The files on the table weren't just paperwork. They were proof of a long, patient plan. And she had been a participant unknowingly at first, then complicit as Evan tightened his influence. The room grew colder. Rain streaked the windows, a constant reminder that outside forces could not touch the truth inside. Claire reached for a folder labeled with Margaret's maiden name, flipping it open to reveal photographs of procedures, doctor's notes, and detailed monitoring logs. "These experiments," Claire said slowly. "Someone was testing, controlling, manipulating, and you were their target, Mom." Margaret's mouth went dry. The realization hit with crushing force. Each doctor's visit, each whispered warning, each insistence on following protocol, it had all been orchestrated. The pregnancy she had clung to as a miracle was never natural. It had been designed. She sat heavily, pressing a hand to her stomach. A sharp fear surged through her chest. This child, her hope, her reason for living, had been entangled in something she did not understand, something far larger than either her or Evan. Claire reached out, squeezing her mother's hand. "We need to know everything. Who's behind this, why you were chosen, and how far it goes." Margaret nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. A truth she had avoided for so long now demanded attention. She had lived in denial, believing love or faith had brought her here. But the files, the signs, and Evan's calm dominance told another story. A story of control, calculation, and deception. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and Margaret realized that the fragile world she had tried to protect was already crumbling. She was no longer alone. Claire's presence brought clarity and urgency, but also danger. If the people behind this knew she was questioning, the consequences could be immediate, cruel, and irreversible. Margaret swallowed hard, steadying herself against the edge of the table. The lies that had shaped her life were no longer secrets, they were weapons. And the next step, she knew, would uncover the full extent of the truth. Something had been set in motion long ago, and neither she nor Clare could stop the forces that now surrounded them. A quiet knock at the door made Margaret's heart leap. She glanced toward it, the shadows behind the woods stretching longer, as if warning her that the next revelation was closer than she realized. Margaret woke with a heaviness she could not ignore. Her joints ached in unfamiliar ways, her head throbbed, and each breath felt like pulling air through thick cloth. The previous night's revelations, Claire's insistence, and the weight of the clinic documents pressed down on her. Yet it was her body, betraying her silently, that demanded attention. By mid-morning, the weakness had grown. She stumbled slightly while making tea, spilling it across the counter. The warmth on her hands did nothing to distract her from the growing panic. She pressed both hands to her stomach, feeling a flutter that was almost reassuring. But her pulse rattled against her ribs with urgency, a warning she could no longer ignore. Claire watched silently from the doorway, concern etched into every line of her face. "Mom, we need to call the doctor," she said. Her voice was firm yet gentle, but Margaret shook her head. "No," Margaret whispered almost instinctively. "Not yet. I can manage. I've managed before." But it was not just fatigue. The symptoms were creeping in with a rhythm too precise to be coincidence. Dizziness, palpitations, shortness of breath, they hinted at a body under siege. Margaret tried to focus on the miracle, the life growing inside her, but every step felt like a betrayal of her own strength. Evan appeared shortly after, smiling in his usual calm way. He hovered at her side, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. "You're overdoing it," he said. "Let me handle things." Margaret allowed herself a flicker of relief, but her intuition, honed over decades of survival, whispered danger. His guidance felt too precise, too controlling. His concern, she realized, masked something darker, a deliberate shaping of her reality, her choices, her limits. By evening, she could no longer ignore the intensity of the pain and exhaustion. Her vision blurred intermittently, and she felt lightheaded. Claire insisted on calling the doctor, her voice edged with fear and frustration. When the paramedics arrived, Evan moved alongside her, calm, directing questions, taking charge with an ease that unsettled both women. The hospital was stark, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as monitors beeped steadily. Margaret lay on the bed, drifting in and out of consciousness. Nurses moved around her, checking vitals, adjusting IV lines, whispering about complications. Her body, once a vessel of hope, now felt like an enemy. Claire stood at her side, gripping her mother's hand, refusing to leave. Margaret's gaze flicked to the machines, each beep a reminder that the pregnancy carried consequences far heavier than joy. She realized with a sharp clarity that the miracle she had clung to was no longer a matter of faith. It was a fragile experiment, teetering on the edge of catastrophe. Evan's calm voice hovered over her, soothing yet precise, every word measured. Margaret's mind registered the control, the quiet orchestration, and a chilling thought emerged. The pregnancy was not natural. The body that had fought so hard, that had welcomed life at 63, was now rebelling, not because of age, but because of manipulation she had yet to fully understand. As the night deepened, monitors began showing irregularities. Margaret's heartbeat faltered intermittently, oxygen levels dipped. Doctors whispered urgently, and Claire's eyes widened in alarm. Margaret pressed her hand to her chest, struggling to stay conscious, realizing that the miracle she had trusted might have been a trap. And then, as the machines beeped faster, a shadow of realization crossed her mind. This was no ordinary complication. Something deliberate had been set in motion. Someone, somewhere, had orchestrated every step to lead to this moment. And Margaret, despite all her resolve, could feel herself slipping toward the unknown, powerless in a body that had begun to fail. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and fear. Margaret lay in bed, pale and trembling, as monitors beeped in steady rhythm, each sound a reminder that her body was no longer entirely her own. Claire hovered beside her, gripping her mother's hand like a lifeline, her eyes darting toward Evan, who stood near the doorway with a calm that made Margaret uneasy. Evan's presence was comforting in its precision. He adjusted pillows, asked the nurses questions in a tone that suggested confidence rather than curiosity. Every movement, every word, conveyed concern, but it was the type of concern that demanded obedience, a careful choreography designed to soothe while keeping control firmly in his hands. Margaret could feel it, deep in her chest, a subtle tightening that had been there since he arrived, growing stronger with every decision he claimed for her. Claire could see it too. Her mother's discomfort, the small flinch at Evan's hand resting on the bedrail, the hesitant nods as he spoke for her. She stepped closer, her voice sharp. "Evan, step back." "She can answer for herself." Evan turned, expression unshaken. "Margaret trusts me," he said, voice soft but firm, as if repeating a mantra. "I'm helping her." Margaret wanted to protest, to tell him she could speak, that she could decide, but the words caught in her throat. It was easier to nod, to allow him to speak, because resistance had always come at a cost. Even now, the calm in his voice carried a threat she could not fully name. Later, during rounds, the doctors addressed him as much as Margaret. They discussed emergency procedures, dietary restrictions, and monitoring schedules with him as the central figure, inadvertently confirming the power he wielded over her. Each time he spoke, Margaret felt a faint pulse of fear ripple through her. His guidance was not simply care, it was a subtle assertion of authority. Claire watched, fists clenched, as Evan guided her mother through questions, corrected minor mistakes, and signed forms Margaret had not read. "This isn't love," Claire whispered to herself. "It's control, pure control." Margaret's mind raced. Every comforting word, every gentle hand on her shoulder now felt like part of a script she was compelled to follow. She remembered the whispers in the past, Thomas Hale's quiet dominance, and realized the pattern had returned in a different form. Evan's affection was carefully measured, his guidance seemingly benign, yet it dictated the rhythm of her days, the choices she believed were hers. As night fell, Evan insisted on staying by her side. He adjusted the lighting, monitored her IV, and spoke softly about the future, about timelines, precautions, about the life they were supposedly building. Margaret listened, torn between gratitude and fear, the line between protection and possession blurring. Claire confronted him quietly in the hallway. "You're manipulating her." "She's terrified and you know it. Step away." Evan's smile was calm, almost disarming. "Claire, you misunderstand. I only want what's best for her." But Claire knew better. She had seen the signs: isolation, subtle coercion, a presence that replaced independence with dependence. Love, she realized, could be a weapon when wielded by the wrong hands. Margaret watched from the bed, her pulse uneven, knowing that the person she had welcomed into her life was not entirely what he seemed. His devotion was a mask, his affection a method. And yet she felt unable to escape the gravity of it. That night, as Evan adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, Margaret felt a chill run through her spine. Somewhere beneath the reassurance, beneath the careful attention and the whispered promises, she understood a terrifying truth. Control disguised as love was the most dangerous kind. And in the shadows of the room, Claire's glare cut through the calm, a silent promise that the full extent of Evan's deception would not remain hidden for long. The tension coiled, waiting for the moment it would snap. Margaret stared at the ceiling, the fluorescent light above casting harsh lines across her pale face. The hospital room was silent, save for the soft beeping of monitors and the distant footsteps in the hallway. She had spent weeks believing this pregnancy was her own decision, her triumph at 63, a miracle she had earned. But the truth pressed in now, undeniable and suffocating. The choice had never truly been hers. It started small, subtle. Evan's presence at every appointment, his calm guidance, the way he spoke for her, decided for her, steered every conversation. At first, she had welcomed it. She had been lonely, vulnerable, craving care. Yet now, lying in bed, she realized how much of her life he had quietly directed without her awareness. Every consent form he had signed, every medical decision she thought she had made, it had been filtered through his will. Claire stood at the bedside, her gaze unwavering. "Mom, you let him do this," she said softly but firmly. "You weren't free to say no." Margaret's throat tightened. She wanted to argue to defend herself, but deep down, she knew it was true. The miracle she had celebrated, the life she had cherished, had been carefully engineered by someone else. The realization made her feel both helpless and betrayed. "I thought I was choosing," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. "I believed it was mine." Claire took her hand, gripping it tightly. "He made you believe that." Every step, every gentle word, every promise, it was all manipulation. "You didn't have a choice, Mom, not really." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. The control Evan wielded had been subtle, almost invisible, but now that it was laid bare, she could see the extent of it. He had isolated her, managed her fears, and shaped her decisions under the guise of love. Even the pregnancy, the miracle she had held onto for so long, had been part of his plan. Memories surfaced unbidden. Late-night calls, mysterious packages, unsolicited advice, the precise timing of appointments, the careful way he guided her hand on paperwork. It all converged into a single, terrifying truth. He had orchestrated every step of her life since he entered it, and she had been none the wiser. Claire's voice cut through her spiral of realization. "We have to uncover everything he's done, Mom. If we don't, it'll never stop." Margaret nodded, swallowing her fear. A new resolve emerged, fragile but determined. She had allowed herself to be manipulated for too long. But now she would reclaim what she could, even if it meant confronting the full weight of Evan's deception. Outside, rain streaked the windows, mirroring the storm inside Margaret. She understood with a sinking clarity that the pregnancy was both a blessing and a trap, a symbol of hope twisted into control. The life growing inside her had become entangled with someone else's plan, and she could no longer pretend she had autonomy. Evan appeared in the doorway, his smile calm, reassuring, the very picture of concern. "You're looking well," he said. Margaret's heart raced. She forced a smile, but it was hollow. She knew now that every word, every gesture was carefully measured to keep her compliant. She could no longer trust the comfort he offered. Clare stepped between them. "Stop pretending you're just helping," she said firmly. "We see what this really is." Evan's smile faltered, the first crack in his composure. He studied Margaret, as if calculating the moment to reclaim control. Margaret pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling the life within her. The child had been caught in someone else's design, but she would protect it. And in that resolve, she discovered the first spark of true choice, one that no one could take from her. A low knock at the door interrupted the tension, sharp and deliberate. Margaret and Clare exchanged a glance, hearts pounding. Whoever it was, the next moment would force truths into the open, truths that had been hidden too long, and decisions that were no longer hers to make alone. The hospital hummed with quiet urgency, fluorescent lights flickering over walls too white to hide tension. Margaret lay in bed, fragile, every monitor's beep echoing like a warning through her chest. The events of the past days pressed down, suffocating in their weight. Clare refused to leave, her grip firm on her mother's hand, while Evan moved around them with careful precision, keeping the rhythm of control intact, or so he believed. By late evening, Margaret's body could no longer comply. Her pulse faltered, oxygen levels dipped, and a new, frightening pain spread across her abdomen. Nurses hurried in and out, voices sharp, machines alarming. Every movement felt chaotic yet methodical. Margaret felt her mind detach, watching herself as if she were someone else entirely, a passenger in her own body. Clare turned to Evan, voice trembling with anger. "Step back. Let her speak for herself. She doesn't need you controlling this." Evan's calm facade cracked slightly, eyes narrowing. "I'm keeping her safe," he said softly, but the edge beneath his tone betrayed a dangerous certainty. "If I don't, she could lose everything." Margaret closed her eyes, the truth unspooling inside her mind. Safety had been a lie. Every act of so-called care, every gentle correction, every whispered promise had been control in disguise. The miracle pregnancy, the moment she had cherished for weeks, had been carefully orchestrated by someone else, and now the consequences of that manipulation were crushing her. Doctors arrived, surrounding the bed. Instructions were shouted, IV lines adjusted, monitors recalibrated. Margaret's vision blurred. She could see the chaos but not feel its full meaning. She clutched Clare's hand, finding grounding in her daughter's presence. "Mom, stay with me," Clare urged. "You hear me? Fight for me. Fight for yourself." Margaret nodded weakly, but the pain surged, a relentless tide she could no longer restrain. Evan hovered, watching, his control slipping as the medical team demanded action beyond his influence. The truth became unavoidable. He could not manage what was happening now. His careful orchestration, his dominance, was meaningless in the face of reality. Hours seemed to compress into minutes. Every sound, every beep, every rush step echoed in Margaret's mind. She realized with clarity that the pregnancy, the so-called miracle, had been a trap. The life she carried was entangled in designs she could not comprehend, and the person she had trusted most was part of the machinery, guiding her without her consent. Clare shouted instructions to the doctors, her voice cutting through the panic. Nurses followed orders, monitors alarmed, and Evan stepped back, silent now, stripped of authority. Margaret's chest heaved, body trembling violently, yet somewhere in the chaos, a new awareness bloomed. She understood the fragility of her situation and the stakes of what she had been manipulated into. Then, a sudden hush fell over the room. The monitors beeped irregularly, slowing, then stabilizing just enough for breath to return. Margaret lay back, exhausted, soaked in sweat, every nerve alert. The storm had passed for now, but nothing was resolved. Clare's eyes met Margaret's. "Mom, we need the truth," she said firmly. "Who did this? Who planned it all?" Margaret's lips parted to speak, But Evan's shadow lingered at the edge of the room, a calm, dangerous presence even as his influence faltered. She knew now that the answers were bigger than either of them imagined. Outside the room, hospital lights reflected on rain-slicked streets. A quiet, patient hand had been orchestrating events far longer than anyone realized. The night had collapsed everything Margaret had believed, everything Evan had controlled. But the final revelation, the dark secret behind it all, was still waiting to emerge. Somewhere in that quiet, a phone buzzed, a file opened, and a truth began to uncoil, one that would shake every belief Margaret had held about choice, love, and life itself. The morning light crept through the blinds, pale and cold, illuminating the hospital room where Margaret lay, exhausted and fragile. Claire sat beside her, clutching her mother's hand, unwilling to let go, unwilling to let the past remain hidden any longer. Outside, the city carried on as if unaware of the storm that had consumed their lives. But inside, the truth waited, patient, unrelenting. Margaret had survived the night, but she knew the cost had been high. Her body had faltered, yes, but it was the control, the lies, the carefully constructed manipulations that had nearly destroyed her. And now the full scope of Evan's plan was beginning to unfold, piece by calculated piece. Claire leaned closer, her voice low and urgent. "Mom, I need you to tell me everything. Every call, every delivery, every meeting you couldn't explain, I need the truth." Margaret drew a trembling breath, the words heavy on her tongue. "It wasn't just him," she whispered. "It was never just him," Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" Margaret's mind raced. She remembered every subtle intervention, every forced choice, every promise of safety that had always come with a cost. The fertility treatments, the monitoring, the constant presence of Evan, it was part of a larger network, a scheme that preyed on women like her. Women isolated, lonely, desperate for hope. Margaret had been chosen, not by chance, but because someone had calculated her vulnerability. "They've been experimenting," Margaret said, voice shaking, "for years with women like me." It wasn't a miracle, it was a plan. Claire's hands tightened around hers. Who would do this?" Margaret hesitated, fear and shame threatening to silence her. Then, with a clarity born of survival, she spoke. "A clinic, a network, people in positions of trust. They promised care, offered hope, and Evan, he was their agent. He guided me, controlled me. Every choice I thought was mine was theirs." The room seemed to grow colder. Claire could feel it, the weight of decades of deception pressing down. Margaret continued, recounting calls from unknown numbers, deliveries of medications she had never requested, early fertility procedures that had been arranged long before Evan appeared in her life. Every memory formed a pattern, a web of manipulation that extended far beyond the walls of the hospital. They don't care about life," Margaret whispered. "Not really, they care about control. About testing limits, about proving something, and I was a participant without knowing it." Claire's eyes widened, horror and anger mingling. "Mom, this isn't just abuse, this is criminal. We need evidence, we need to expose them." Margaret nodded weakly. Her hands trembled, but there was a new fire in her eyes. After months of fear, manipulation, and deception, she felt a sliver of reclaiming power. The truth, once hidden, was now her weapon. Outside, rain drummed against the windows. Evan had been quietly removed from the room earlier, escorted by hospital security under Claire's insistence, though his calm, calculating gaze had promised future consequences. Margaret felt a strange sense of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the network was vast, patient, and dangerous. Claire reached for the files she had uncovered in the kitchen weeks earlier. Together, they reviewed every appointment, every signature, every anomaly, tracing the path that had led Margaret into the hands of those who sought to control her. Each revelation tightened the knot in Margaret's chest, but it also illuminated the route to justice. Margaret's lips curved into a faint, tired smile. "It's not too late," she said softly. "We can stop them, at least we can stop them from using anyone else." Claire squeezed her hand. "We will, Mom. Every step of the way." For the first time in months, Margaret felt a cautious sense of agency returning. She was still weak, still vulnerable, but no longer alone. The child she carried, the life she had feared was a trap, had become a symbol of resistance, a reason to fight against the darkness that had ensnared her. Later, as investigators arrived to collect testimony and review the evidence, Margaret sat quietly, reflecting on the journey. The manipulation, the lies, the near destruction of her body, all of it had been part of a calculated plan, and yet she had survived. She had refused to give up, refused to accept the false narrative of control. The dark secret once hidden was now exposed. Margaret understood that the danger was far from over, that the people behind the network were still out there, waiting for opportunity. But she also understood the power of truth, of courage, and of reclaiming choice. She pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling the life inside her, fragile but resilient. That life was no longer a pawn in someone else's game. It was a testament to survival, to defiance, and to hope. As Claire looked down at her mother, tears glimmering in her eyes, she whispered, "We'll make them pay, Mom, for you, for everyone." Margaret nodded, a slow, determined movement. The hospital room felt less like a prison now, more like a battlefield where truth had finally begun to win. The dark secret had been revealed, but the fight for justice, the real reckoning, was only just beginning.